A whisper from a shadowed past stirs beneath the fog. A secret marked in red ink. A silent message that cost lives. In a city where every move is calculated and every ally may conceal a foe, a deadly game unfolds beyond the reach of light. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. The wind was restless that evening in late October, howling against the windows of our rooms at Baker Street, as though some unseen beast prowled the streets of London. Within, however, a different kind of stillness prevailed, one wrought not by weather, but by the curious temperament of Sherlock Holmes. He had not spoken in over an hour, save for the occasional moan coaxed from his violin, which he played languidly as he stared into the fire with the intense vacancy of thought that often preceded his most brilliant feats of deduction. I sat nearby, nursing a tepid brandy and flipping through the Times, only to find my gaze drifting back toward Holmes with no small amount of concern. There was something different in his silence, not the boredom that often led him to cocaine or revolver practice, but a kind of strained anticipation. His eyes had that faraway glint I had come to recognize over the years. Not idleness, but listening for something he alone expected. And then it came, a brisk knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's steps were light but swift on the stairs, and within moments she handed Holmes a blue-edged envelope on a silver tray. Holmes rose at once, taking it with a sudden alacrity that made me blink. The seal bore the stamp of the Foreign Office. He tore it open, read the contents, and then, quite without flourish, tossed it to me. "Well, Watson," he said, reaching for his coat and walking stick, "it seems we are to pay a visit to the Danube." The telegram was concise but chilling. British Consulate, Budapest. Third Foreign National, Lord Halberd. Murdered in 3 weeks. Pattern unclear. Assistance urgently requested. I looked up to find Holmes already lacing his boots. "This is not some errant street crime," Holmes murmured, as he gathered a battered valise from beneath the divan. "An Austrian count, a Russian bookseller, and now an English peer. All murdered in the same city, within days of one another, and all without clear motive." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But the killer has left something behind, something subtle. Otherwise, the consulate would not have summoned me." I could see it now, that familiar energy, like a match struck in the fog. This was no mere mystery. It was a summons Holmes had been silently awaiting. The pattern was forming, though not yet visible to me. I was still blinking at the idea of Budapest when Holmes spoke again. "Pack for cold weather, Watson. This one may chill us in more ways than one." He moved with purpose now, in sharp contrast to the indolent figure of an hour ago. I had a sense these past few weeks that something was abroad in Europe. Not war, no, not yet, but a different kind of smoke on the wind. He turned to me then, with a curious glint in his eye. "Do you know what I despise most, Watson?" "Boredom?" I ventured. "Inaccuracy," he corrected. "And this telegram, it smells of precisely that. A crime committed with too much neatness, too much intention. Let us go, before the scent fades." There was no arguing with him when he reached this state. The hunt had begun, though no hound had yet bayed. Holmes had caught the first whiff on the air. As I packed our cases with warm coats, medical supplies, and my revolver, more out of habit than expectation, I noted Holmes placing a warm volume of ciphers and secret alphabets in his own bag, alongside a pair of false spectacles and a Turkish fez. "Planning to impersonate a Balkan philosopher?" I asked. "I may be required to do worse," he replied. Then, glancing at me with unsettling calm, he added, "This is no ordinary inquiry, Watson. If I am correct, and I very much hope I am not, this case will not end without consequence." He said nothing more, and I found myself double-checking the lock on my medical bag. We boarded the train from Victoria under grey skies, and sat for hours as the English countryside gave way to the rolling heart of Europe. Holmes was unreadably quiet, gazing out the window with a sort of still fury. When I inquired about the victims, he merely shook his head. Not yet. Let us see Budapest first. I knew then he had already formed a theory, or part of one, and was refusing to speak it aloud, perhaps out of caution, or perhaps, as I have often suspected, because he enjoyed watching the pieces fall into place in front of me. Whatever the reason, I sensed that this case was already far more personal to Holmes than he was prepared to admit. The Orient Express steamed forward into the cold, and I could not shake the feeling that something waited for us in the fog. The consulate stood at the corner of a broad boulevard, half veiled in creeping ivy and the unmistakable hush of foreign soil. We were greeted by a secretary with grave eyes who ushered us through oak-panelled corridors and into a sitting room where a tall, pale gentleman rose to meet us. His posture was military, though softened now by grief and anxiety. "Sir Lionel Verwood," he said with a stiff nod. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson." Holmes inclined his head, but said nothing, his eyes already appraising our host. The man's fingers twitched as he poured tea he did not touch, and he spoke with the brittle edge of one who had not slept properly in days. "It's Halberd," he said at last, voice roughened by restraint. "They murdered Halberd." Holmes merely gestured for him to continue, but I noticed the brief tightening at the corner of his mouth. Verwood's account came out haltingly at first, like a man reluctant to let go of what he could scarcely believe had happened. "Lord Halberd and I were travelling separately, though we had arranged to meet here in Budapest for a quiet week before continuing on to Vienna," he said. "We had taken rooms at the Hotel Erzsébet, modest but private." He swallowed hard. "I called on him yesterday morning. The staff said he had not come down for breakfast. I went up, thinking nothing of it. He was never an early riser. The door was ajar. I found him." He broke off, and for a moment I feared he might lose himself to the memory. Holmes let the silence stretch just long enough. "He was on the floor," Verwood said at last. "Fully dressed, stabbed cleanly through the sternum, no sign of a struggle, the window open, and this." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small envelope, brittle, scorched, and bearing only fragments of handwriting. "It was in his hand, partially burned. I extinguished it." Holmes took it without a word, holding it to the light. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting indeed." The letter was almost illegible, its edges singed and crumbling, but enough remained for Holmes to reconstruct several lines. "Tell the one who reads red ink to stop. The game is already lost." He repeated the phrase aloud, turning it over like a coin between fingers. "Red ink," he mused. "A curious metaphor, or perhaps not metaphor at all." Verwood looked bewildered. "You think it has meaning?" "Oh, undoubtedly," Holmes said dryly. "Men do not waste their dying moments on literary flourish. If Halberd chose to burn this note, and failed to destroy it, then what remains was precisely what he intended to survive." I glanced at Verwood, who was staring at Holmes as though unsure whether to be grateful or unnerved. "Tell me," Holmes said quietly, "did your friend have any interest in cryptography?" "He served in the diplomatic corps," Verwood replied. "So yes, quite a lot, in fact." Holmes smiled without mirth. It was then, Verwood added, almost as an afterthought, "There were two others. Before Halberd." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You've my attention." "A Russian named Suvarin," Verwood continued, "formerly a translator, and a retired Austrian count, von Brixell. Both found dead here in Pest within the past 3 weeks. The police dismissed them as isolated tragedies. But I knew Halberd had once worked with Suvarin, years ago in Belgrade, and von Brixell was part of the same peace mission. I felt a shiver of something colder than the Hungarian wind. Holmes steepled his fingers. 3 men from different countries, no robbery, no clear motive, all connected by the ghosts of diplomacy. He turned his gaze toward the burned letter again. No, Watson, this is not the work of a madman. This is a sequence, a careful one. And there was a glint in his eye that I had not seen since Moriarty. We were about to depart when Holmes's voice halted Verwood at the threshold. "Forgive me," he said, rising, "but before we go further, I must ask, what were you doing in the Varus-Legat district this morning?" Verwood froze. "How do you—" "Your boots," Holmes said mildly. "Traces of crushed gravel dust specific to the Legat path. Its stones have a reddish cast not found elsewhere in the city, and your walking stick bears a fresh dent acquired, I'd wager, against the iron fence that surrounds the Sekenyi baths." Verwood blinked rapidly. "You followed me?" "No, you carried your journey with you," Holmes replied. "As for the Turkish tobacco on your right cuff, one can only acquire that from Rosnyai's bazaar, near the square." Verwood looked away. "I walked to clear my head." "Naturally," Holmes said. "But why lie about it?" The silence returned. "I was being followed," Verwood admitted. "I panicked." "By whom?" "I don't know. A tall man, overcoat, gloves even in sunlight." Holmes merely nodded, his expression unreadable. But I knew that look well. Something had been confirmed. "Thank you," he said. "You've told us more than you realize." Holmes waited until we were alone before speaking. "He was at Rosnyai's," he said. "That much is plain. The tobacco scent was faint but distinct, and the angle of the flake told me it fell while he was seated, not passing through." "You think the shop is connected?" I asked. "I know it is. The Russian, the Austrian, and now the Englishman, all 3 were sighted there days before their deaths. And now Verwood, who has the sense to be frightened, yet not the courage to admit where he went." "Why hide it?" I asked. "Shame or guilt?" Holmes gave me a sharp glance. "Perhaps neither. Perhaps it's what he saw inside that he fears more than what he did." "What are we to do?" I asked. "We find the bookseller," Holmes said. "And we find him quickly, because I very much doubt he is a man of fiction." Later that evening, with the lamps of Pest flickering like uneasy thoughts, Holmes laid out a map across our writing table. "Here," he said, tapping the Vachi Ucha. "An antiquarian bookshop, small, anonymous, and never open before noon. The victims each made purchases here, according to the hotel staff who receive parcels on their behalf. The shopkeeper is said to speak 6 languages and answer to none." "Rosnyai," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "There is a trail, Watson. It's not yet blood, but it smells of something just as old. Suvarin was known to collect rare wartime dispatches. Von Brixel specialized in redacted treaties. Halbert kept a cipher diary. And all passed through Rosnyai's shop before they died," I said. "Just so, and now Verwood has done the same." Holmes rolled the map closed. "In this game, the knight is moving diagonally across the board, removing pieces one by one." "A knight," I echoed. "Merely a metaphor, for now." Holmes looked out of the window, eyes distant. "But I do wonder, Watson, if we're already standing in check. Budapest, as I first beheld it, struck me with its strange contradiction of grandeur and melancholy. The fog rolled heavy across the wide avenues, muffling the hoofbeats of carriages and wrapping the Gothic spires in ghostly veils. Holmes, naturally, seemed invigorated by the gloom. "This city," he remarked as we crossed the chain bridge, "has an architecture of concealment, secrets built into its stones." There was a stillness beneath the bustle, something that made one speak in lower tones, as if the walls themselves were listening. Though we passed fine cafes and cheerful market squares, I could not shake the impression that the city watched us back. Holmes, for his part, was at his most alert. Every gesture, every shadow, measured and filed away. I confess, I found myself both comforted and unnerved by his intensity. He was, I knew, not merely sightseeing, he was hunting, and Budapest, in all its splendour, was prey. Our destination, when at last we arrived, was marked by little more than a brass number and a dust-filmed window that revealed only shadowed shelves within. Holmes knocked once, sharply. After a pause, the door creaked open to reveal a man of slight stature, his hair thin and grey, his back bent in the manner of a man grown into his books. "Rosnyai," Holmes said warmly, adopting a faint Central European lilt. "I was told you might have certain materials of interest." The bookseller gave the smallest nod and led us inside, not asking our names. The air was thick with dust and old leather. Holmes drifted toward a shelf marked Politica and drew out a slim volume in French. Rosnyai watched him with careful indifference. I, meanwhile, noted the man's pale, twitching eyelids and the way his fingers fidgeted when not occupied. Holmes asked after a book on Balkan correspondence. Rosnyai disappeared into the back for a full minute before returning with a wrapped bundle. "Curious man," I whispered when we stepped out. Said Holmes. "A seller of truths he pretends not to read, but he has read them, Watson, and one of them has frightened him." Later that afternoon, Holmes reviewed the encounter with surgical precision. He spoke English to us, but began in German. That slip alone suggests his education came under Austrian influence, not purely Hungarian. I admitted I had not caught the nuance. "Most wouldn't," Holmes replied, but his vowel stress gave him away. Furthermore, when I asked about Russian editions, he responded too swiftly and with the hard zhok of the Muscovite South. No Hungarian picks that up without having lived among it. I sat back, mildly stunned. He could be from anywhere then. "Not quite," Holmes said. "He is pretending to be from everywhere. That is the most suspicious origin of all." I reminded Holmes of Rosnyai's scar, jagged, curving along the collarbone. "Military," I suggested. "Or worse," Holmes murmured, "interrogation, which tells us he has lived not only as a man of books, but as one who has been questioned violently." I shuddered at the implication, and yet he runs a peaceful little shop. "Peaceful, yes," Holmes said, "but it is not his business that intrigues me. It is his silence. There are absences in that man, Watson, as if entire chapters of his life have been torn out." Holmes had purchased a leather-bound volume titled Treaties and Territorial Compromises of the 1870s, a work as dull in appearance as it was dense in substance. As we returned to our lodgings, I ventured to ask what use it might serve. "None at all," Holmes replied cheerfully. "I chose it for its binding. The paper is thick enough to conceal a message, which I left inside." "A message? A baited one," he said, "written in Latinized Hungarian, an invitation, or perhaps a warning. We shall see which he considers it." He then produced a thin sheet of tracing paper on which he had scribbled a ciphered riddle. "It speaks of a fifth visitor, one who reads but does not forget." "Fifth?" I asked. "If there have been 4 deaths, then—" "Precisely," he said. "We are either next or not on the list." His expression darkened. "Rosnyai's reaction will tell us. If he flees, we know his guilt. If he contacts us, we know his fear. If he does nothing—" Holmes paused and looked out at the Danube, where barges passed like phantoms in the mist. "Then, my dear Watson, we are dealing with someone who has no reason left to run." Holmes sent me that evening to the consular library to research the diplomatic histories of the 3 victims. I confess, it was not a task I undertook with enthusiasm, but I soon found myself gripped by what emerged. All 3 men, Suvarin the Russian, von Brixel the Austrian, and Halbert the Englishman, had participated in an obscure negotiation in the winter of 1892, following unrest along the Serbian border. The mission had been publicly framed as a failed peace talk, but buried within the consular archives, I discovered several references to an Operation Neil, a codename I could find no official listing for. The 3 men had not merely negotiated, they had gathered intelligence, secretly and at personal risk. What they saw, I could only imagine. When I presented these findings to Holmes, he simply nodded. Precisely as I suspected. A shared past, buried under treaties and titles. And you believe someone is unearthing it now? Not unearthing, Watson, Holmes replied. Erasing, one by one. He turned the pages of the old book slowly, as if they might yet whisper back the names of the dead. We are not investigating murders. We are watching a file being deleted, by hand, in blood. It was Holmes who suggested an afternoon walk along the Sechenyi chain bridge, though I suspected from the start that his route was not idle meandering. Sure enough, as we reached the midpoint where the Danube churned grey beneath us, a tall man in a dark officer's coat appeared from the opposite side, his moustache as trim as his uniform. Colonel Fakit, Holmes greeted him, as if surprised. Mr. Holmes, the man replied, not bothering to disguise his disdain. Dr. Watson, you find our city intriguing, I hear. Enigmatic, Holmes said. But then, I do enjoy puzzles, especially those wrapped in uniform silence. Fakete did not smile. Your presence was not requested by the police. Nor was your silence by the dead. Holmes returned mildly. A tension crackled between them, but it was the colonel who yielded first. There was something, he said finally. Each body bore a small red mark. Ink, perhaps, or wax. Our pathologist remains unsure. Where? Holmes asked. Just beneath the collarbone, always left side, circular, but smudged. Fakete said no more, but his eyes lingered on Holmes as we departed. He suspects us, I said. Let him, Holmes replied. But more importantly, Watson, I suspect him. That evening, Holmes stood by the window of our rented apartment, watching the streetlights burn against the mist like watchful eyes. He did not speak for some time, but I knew the shape of his thoughts. Rosnyai's scar, Watson, he said at last. Too sharp to be surgical. That was punishment, likely inflicted in the war. Interrogated? I asked. Or worse, Holmes replied. But he hides it with pride, which tells me he endured, perhaps even survived something others did not. And the red mark? A seal, Holmes said, tapping the ashtray with absent rhythm. Placed near the heart. Symbolic, precise. Too deliberate to be arbitrary. But what does it mean? The victims, he went on. Each served in covert diplomatic missions. They were messengers, Watson. What happens to messengers who survive the war but carry too much truth? They become loose ends, I said grimly. Holmes nodded. And someone still playing the old game, has taken it upon themselves to tie those ends up. I saw then that this was no ordinary criminal pursuit for Holmes. There was something in his bearing, cold and analytical, but also solemn, as if he had glimpsed the machinery behind nations and did not care for how it turned. And the seal? I asked, breaking the long silence. You said it's a symbol, but a symbol for what? Holmes did not answer at once. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and turned away from the window. That, Watson, he said with maddening calm, depends on who it was meant for. You think it's a message? Or a warning, he said. Perhaps even a farewell. Symbols are like wounds. They only reveal their shape when pressed. I tried to continue, but he raised a hand. No further questions, my dear fellow. Not tonight. I knew better than to argue when he adopted that particular tone, but I could not ignore the feeling that, for the first time in many months, Sherlock Holmes was not entirely sure what came next. And worse still, I sensed that he knew, whatever it was, might already be in motion. We returned to our rooms as the bells of Pest began their cold evening chime. Holmes set about reconstructing the burnt letter from Halberd with a care that would have done justice to any museum conservator. He laid it across blotting sheets, gently applying steam to reveal the faintest remaining strokes. I watched, silent, as the fragment took shape. Observe, Watson, he said at length, tapping a faint symbol scrawled in the margin. The angle of the hand, the trailing downward flourish. This is not mere handwriting. It is field code. He drew a notebook from his satchel, one he had kept from his time assisting the Foreign Office, and flipped rapidly through the pages. Ah, yes, pattern 14, Balkan cipher variation, post 1891. You're saying this note was written in code? I asked. Not just code, he replied. This was a dead agent's tongue. He held it up to the lamp. Halberd knew it. Whoever sent this wanted him to decode it. But when he did, Holmes let the paper drop. He tried to destroy it. Whatever message it carried, it was not meant to be found. His voice, usually so precise, had taken on a quieter edge. And yet, we found it. Holmes leaned back in the armchair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. You remember the phrase? He asked. Tell the one who reads red ink to stop. The game is already lost. It sounded like a poetic warning, I said. No, he replied. It is a directive. He rose and crossed the room to retrieve an envelope marked with red wax. In 1889, a small network of British field agents operating in the Balkans adopted a simple code. When a mission was compromised beyond salvage, a red ink phrase was delivered. It meant, abort all contact, go dark, burn every trace. The red ink wasn't metaphor, it was procedural language. I stared at him. You think Halberd was receiving this? More than receiving, Holmes said. He was being warned. Someone told him the old network was under threat, or had already been exposed. He looked out the window, not at the Danube, but beyond it. And Halberd panicked. He burned the message, but too late. The warning was never meant to be preserved. And yet, ironically, its remnants may be the only thread left connecting the killer to his motive. He turned back to me. We're not merely chasing a murderer, Watson. We are following a ghost protocol. Rosnyai. Holmes said the name flatly, as though it left a taste behind. He is not who he claims to be. His accent is a suit tailored too precisely. His knowledge of foreign volumes, too eclectic to be accidental. He reacted not to our presence, but to the book I requested. He expected it, Watson. Or rather, he expected someone would come looking for it eventually. You think he's a killer? I asked. Holmes shook his head. No, he lacks the confidence. His hands tremble, his movements are measured. But he is complicit. Perhaps blackmailed, perhaps threatened. Or perhaps he's hiding from something far worse than arrest. He pulled from his coat a list he had assembled, the known correspondences of the 3 murdered men. Each had purchased something from Rosnyai within days of their death. Suverin, an annotated Russian translation of Balkan rail maps. Von Brixel, a diplomatic ledger. Halberd, a book that never reached his room. Only Rosnyai would know its contents. Holmes tapped the paper. If someone is erasing the past, Rosnyai is either guarding it or giving it away. And if he's not the enemy? I asked. Then, Holmes replied, he's the last witness still alive. It was just before midnight when the knock came. A hotel porter, breathless and pale, handed Holmes a folded slip of paper. I saw my friend's face change as he read, a rare stillness overtaking him. Watson, he said quietly, Verwood is dead. The words struck like a blow. Where? I asked. His hotel, stabbed. As with Halberd, no sign of struggle. This time, however, the door was locked from within. We hurried to the scene, where the police had already begun their sterile cordon. Holmes identified himself and was reluctantly permitted entry. The room was cold. Verwood lay across the bed, fully clothed, eyes open in what could only be described as startled understanding. A candle had burned low at his bedside. Holmes knelt beside the body, examining the chest. Same blade angle, entry point under the sternum. Then, with gloved fingers, he tilted Verwood's chin, and there it was. A faint red wax impression just below the collarbone. They struck again, I said. Yes, Holmes replied. And this time, under our noses. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees. He was under watch, I reminded him. By whom? Holmes said bitterly. A constable assigned by Feckerty. Do you think? I no longer assume, Watson. I observe. Holmes returned to our rooms that night in silence. Only when he had washed and lit his pipe did he speak. I had hoped Verwood would live through this. He was foolish, yes, but not without a conscience. And now he's gone. And with him, one more link to the past. He removed from his coat a folded handkerchief. Inside it lay a small wax fragment, red as blood, shaped unmistakably into a chest knight. I took this from Verwood's neck, he said. A seal, carefully pressed, then blurred deliberately to obscure the impression. But it was done too quickly. The crest remains. A chess piece, I asked. Indeed, Holmes said. The knight, symbol of indirect movement, unorthodox strategy, and sacrifice. You think the killer left it as a message? No, he said, as a signature. I stared at it. What sort of person signs murder? One who believes the act is not crime, but art. Holmes turned the knight over in his palm, and worse still, one who plays not against the board, but against memory. His eyes flickered toward me. This is not vengeance, Watson. This is orchestration. What now? I asked. Now, Holmes said. We bait the night. As the last embers crumbled in the grate, I turned to Holmes, unable to suppress the unease that had taken firm root in me. You must see it, I said. This mark, this night, Verwood's death. You're on the list, Holmes. He did not turn. You've placed yourself in the path of something far older than a crime. A vendetta, a purge, perhaps even a war carried out in silence. And you are far too visible to escape notice. Still, he said nothing. I rose. Holmes, I am not speaking as your biographer. I am speaking as your friend. Finally, he looked at me. His expression was unreadable, but his voice, when it came, was the softest I had ever heard it. You worry, Watson, because you have something to lose. And you do not, I asked. He gave a faint smile. I never play the game with kings or castles, only knights, and only on odd squares. I could find no reply to that. There was something final in his tone, not resignation, but an acceptance I could neither share nor challenge. In that moment, I felt I had glimpsed a part of Holmes that no deduction could reach, a man who knew the cost of his own brilliance. The next morning, Holmes rose early, dressed with meticulous care, and sat at the writing desk for nearly an hour without speaking. I watched him compose a letter in short, precise lines, pausing only to consult a leather-bound cipher book I'd seen only once before during the Milverton affair. When he finished, he sealed the envelope with red wax and addressed it not to any Budapest authority, but to Mycroft Holmes, Whitehall, London. You're writing to your brother, I said. That means you believe the danger exceeds even your reach. Holmes looked at me with a coolness that bordered on gentleness. This is no longer about Budapest, Watson. It is about records buried beneath flags and hands that move long after their masters have fallen. He handed the envelope to a trusted contact from the British legation, ensuring it would pass through diplomatic channels unexamined. You've not told me all, I said. Nor will I, Holmes replied. Not yet. To name certain things aloud is to conjure them fully, and there are still 2 or 3 shadows whose outlines I must finish drawing. And then, with a sudden shift of energy, he turned toward his violin case. Music, Watson. Today, I require Bach. Later that evening, I found Holmes standing at the window, untouched tea cooling beside him. Do you ever regret it? I asked. This life, this perpetual dance with danger. He didn't move. Regret, he said at last, is for those who hope for peace. And you never did? I pressed. No, he said quietly, but I did hope for a worthy adversary. It appears one has finally emerged. He turned to me then, eyes brighter than I'd seen in weeks. This isn't a case, Watson. It's a message to me, written in blood and wax. Someone wants to play, and they believe I'm still on the board. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was not alone in this, but I knew Holmes well enough to recognize when words were wasted. The game had turned personal, and when it did, Sherlock Holmes did not retreat. He advanced. When Holmes emerged from our lodgings the next morning, I scarcely recognized him. Gone was the lean Englishman in the modest grey overcoat. In his place stood a tall, fastidious gentleman of continental flair, cloaked in a flowing black cape and sporting a monocle that flashed disdainfully beneath the brim of his velvet hat. "I shall be Monsieur Armand Lafosse," he said in a husky drawl, "a collector of diplomatic rarities and defunct alliances." He struck the tip of his cane upon the cobblestones and turned to me. "You, mon ami, shall wait precisely 12 minutes after I enter. If I am not back within 15, enter with facete." I did not like the plan, though Holmes seemed rather pleased with himself. "You think he will fall for it?" I asked. "He won't need to fall," Holmes replied, "only to hesitate." And with that, he disappeared into the fog, his cloak flaring behind him like the shadow of a closing curtain. I stood in silence, counting the seconds with a mixture of dread and disbelief. To see Holmes vanish into an enemy's lair with nothing but a false name and a dialect was not unusual, but the air around this mission felt tighter, as though the city itself held its breath. When I entered Rosnyai's shop, precisely as instructed, I found the proprietor seated behind a counter, cluttered with folios and tattered catalogues. Across from him stood Holmes, or rather Lafosse, perusing a manuscript with exaggerated elegance. "This," Holmes was saying in his thick French accent, "is of considerable interest to my circle. Notes on the Serbian front, yes?" Rosnyai nodded warily. "Unofficial," he muttered. "Unpublished." "Which makes it priceless," Holmes purred. "I am looking for documents, very old, very specific. Things that were once spoken of in whispered rooms. You understand me?" Rosnyai's hands fidgeted beneath the counter. "I do not trade in state secrets," he said flatly. No, of course not," Holmes replied. "But you receive them." The pause that followed was brief but electric. Holmes placed the volume down and leaned slightly forward. "Do you recall a British envoy named Halberd?" Rosnyai blinked. "Or Sovereign, perhaps. Brixel. They all passed through this very room. They bought books. They asked questions." Rosnyai's fingers twitched again. "I do not remember every face. But they all died, monsieur," Holmes whispered. "And now another is dead. Surely you remember that." Rosnyai's mouth opened to speak, but found no sound. Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, that is what I thought." Holmes did not press. Instead, he stepped back from the counter and adopted a pensive tone. "Of course," he mused. "There was a fifth man, wasn't there? The one they called the Falcon." Rosnyai's gaze sharpened at once. "That name. A code, surely," Holmes continued smoothly. "But I've been told he survived, living quietly in Vienna. A collector now, like myself. Still fond of red ink, I hear." Rosnyai's hands froze mid-motion. "He's not real," the man said, but his voice had dropped. "Just a rumour." Holmes tapped the glass of the counter gently. "Rumours are shadows, monsieur, and like shadows, they are cast by something real." "What is it you want from me?" Rosnyai asked. "The truth," Holmes said, abandoning the French accent now entirely. "I want to know why 3 men are dead, a 4th was marked, and you, silent, trembling, remain alive." Rosnyai looked pale as parchment. "You don't understand," he said. "None of you understand. I was warned." "Warned by whom?" "I don't know," he whispered. "The notes came sealed. No return, no trace. Only the night. The wax seal." "And you obeyed," Holmes said coldly. "Yes, I gave them names. I gave them what they asked." "Who sent the first note?" Rosnyai stared. I thought you had." Holmes stepped back, eyes narrow. You never saw the sender? Rosnyai shook his head. Never. Only the seal. At that moment, I knew the trap had worked. Not for the man we suspected, but for the one now lurking just beyond our reach. Holmes gave me the faintest nod. The game had changed. Rosnyai must have caught the shift in Holmes' posture, for he suddenly bolted, brushing past the counter and upsetting a stack of antique ledgers. Holmes called after him once, sharply, but the man paid no heed. I was already moving, and so was Colonel Feckerty, who had been watching from the alley opposite. Rosnyai made it as far as the courtyard before we caught him, his breath ragged, eyes wild. He cried out something in Hungarian I could not understand, but Feckerty responded with surprising restraint, gripping the man's arms and whispering something low and calm into his ear. Rosnyai sagged. I looked to Holmes, who now stood behind me. He ran, I said, and he told us more by doing so than he ever could by staying, Holmes replied. He crouched beside the overturned folios. From one, he extracted a folded parchment hidden, no doubt, among the clutter by a nervous hand. Another list, he murmured. 3 names crossed out, a 4th underlined, the 5th blank. Yours? I asked. No, he said, not mine, someone else. Someone we haven't seen yet. Feckerty stepped forward. What shall we do with him? Holmes met his eyes coolly. We let him speak, Colonel, but not in your office. Somewhere safer. Feckerty did not smile. Neither did Holmes. We took Rosnyai to a disused annex of the National Archives, Feckerty's idea, and a sound one. The place had once served as a private reading room for the Habsburgs, and its walls were thick enough to muffle the desperate confessions of a man like Rosnyai. The bookseller sat slumped in a worn chair, eyes sunken, his fingers twitching over his lap like a man with some old wound that had begun to itch again. I never chose this, he rasped. You must believe that, Doctor. Holmes stood silently, arms folded. I could tell from the tightness in his mouth that he did not yet believe anything. I was only the messenger, Rosnyai insisted. They came to me. They knew about my past, the bribes I took during the war. They threatened exposure. Who is they? Holmes asked, his voice clipped. I never knew. The instructions arrived by post, always unsigned, no handwriting, only type. And sealed, always sealed. What seal? Rosnyai looked up. A night, he said. A black night, wax, thick, almost brittle. It left a scent, burnt cloves. Holmes and I exchanged glances. The first note came 8 months ago, Rosnyai continued. It asked me to watch, that was all. The second gave names, agents who had come to Budapest. I reported on them, and they disappeared. Holmes spoke quietly. And the British major? Rosnyai's voice broke. I warned him. I tried. I sent a blank note with a torn night seal. I thought he would understand. He did, Holmes said. But too late. Rosnyai buried his face in his hands. Holmes turned to me, his voice low. A pawn, Watson. Cleverly used, but a pawn nonetheless. The real player remains hidden. He paused. But not for long. It was Holmes who suggested the location, under the pretext, as he put it, of drama aiding revelation. Colonel Feckerty, ever the pragmatist, did not object to meeting us beneath Matthias Church, in the crypt where the bones of old princes slept beside monks who had written histories no one now read. The chill was penetrating. The dampness clung to one's collar like the fingers of the dead. I assume, Feckerty said, lighting a lantern, this is not about theology. Only about faith, Holmes replied. Faith in patterns, Colonel. Feckerty raised an eyebrow. Patterns? Holmes produced a bundle of folded paper, telegrams, photographs, typewritten letters with corner creases so sharp they might have sliced a less careful hand. These were not isolated events, he said. Your presence at each of the 4 crime scenes was never direct, but always near, always delayed by exactly 23 hours, the same interval between the anonymous messages received by Rosnyai. A coincidence, Fouquet murmured, but not convincingly. Holmes tilted his head. Do you believe in coincidence, Colonel? In espionage? Fouquet did not answer. Tell me, Holmes continued, how does a chess knight move? 2 forward, 1 aside? Precisely, the move that appears indirect, predictable only to the trained mind. There was a pause in which even the lantern seemed to flicker with suspicion. Then again, Holmes said softly, some knights never leave the board, they only change sides. Fouquet's nostrils flared. Holmes took a step closer. And some generals never retired. The crypt had never felt so silent. Holmes remained still, the lantern casting elongated shadows along the crypt's damp stone. Fouquet's fingers twitched ever so slightly near the hem of his greatcoat. I wonder, Holmes said quietly, how long it has been since you commanded men rather than manipulated messengers. You are not merely the recipient of orders, Colonel. You write them. Fouquet's mouth was a tight line, but the corners quivered. Your flair for theatre is undiminished. As is your appetite for control, Holmes replied. Rosnyai's letters were sealed with a knight, yes, but the language, the rhythm, the references to Hungarian folk tales, those bear your signature. A man of your background would hardly use such specific allegories by accident. Fouquet exhaled through his nose, as though tiring of the conversation. You sent those letters, Holmes pressed on. You coordinated the disappearance of Karsai, the false trail in Bratislava, the so-called cipher in the oil painting, all carefully constructed to waste our time and shield your true objective. Which was, Fouquet asked, dryly amused. Erasure, Holmes replied. Not just of men, but of records, of memories, of certain wartime alliances the present regime would not wish unearthed. The 4th victim, Colonel, he was not blackmailing you. He was preparing to publish. For a moment, the silence returned. Then, with no change in expression, Fouquet's right hand moved. Swift as a striking adder, it emerged from beneath the coat, holding a slim, black pistol, a military issue, unmistakable even in the flickering light. I suppose, the Colonel said coolly, this is the part where you lecture me on justice. Holmes did not flinch. No, he murmured. This is the part where you make your final move. Certainly, here is the final section of your Sherlock Holmes script, written in the authentic voice of Dr. John Watson. I had crept into the crypt a minute behind Holmes, moving silently among the cool shadows with a revolver nestled in my palm. Holmes had insisted I remain concealed unless intervention became absolutely necessary. The glint of Fouquet's pistol broke that condition. I did not think. I acted. There was a dull thud as my walking stick, swung from the darkness behind a pillar, struck the Colonel's wrist. A sharp cry escaped him as the weapon clattered across the stone floor, spinning like a startled beetle into the gloom. Fouquet staggered, clutching his arm, and Holmes stepped forward at once, retrieving the pistol with a graceful motion that reminded me momentarily of a fencer disarming an opponent. Fouquet stared at me, incredulous. You're no mere doctor. I make do, I said shortly, though my hand trembled now the danger had passed. Holmes examined the weapon, then tossed it to the floor with a sound of cold disinterest. Rather melodramatic for a man who pretends to be a strategist, resorting to the bullet instead of the bishop. Fouquet opened his mouth, then closed it again. His defiance had evaporated like breath in frost. In that instant, I saw a career soldier who had played the game too long and too well, until even the players around him had become disposable. Holmes turned to me. He said nothing, but the nod he gave, a brief, subtle incline of the head, was acknowledgement enough. Gratitude from Holmes was rare, A wordless version, rarer still. Moments later, footsteps echoed above us. Farkas and the Budapest constabulary, summoned earlier by Holmes with his usual prescience. As they descended, lanterns bobbing, Holmes spoke without turning. "It is curious, Watson, how often the most dangerous men carry not swords, but secrets." And with that, the board was cleared. The air in Budapest had grown colder by the hour, and it was near dawn when we finally returned to our modest lodgings. The Hungarian constabulary had taken charge of Colonel Fekete, who by then resembled a man abandoned by every god he had once trusted. Holmes, as ever, had spoken little. He had not commented on my intervention, nor had he offered any of the typical Holmesian flourishes I'd come to expect after a case's climax. He merely removed his coat, hung it with care upon the peg, and sat before the fire with his fingers steepled, eyes fixed on some invisible point in the flickering coals. I, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the events in the crypt with the quiet crackling of the hearth. My limbs ached, my mind whirled. After a prolonged silence, I cleared my throat. "I suppose," I ventured, "you are now ready to explain what precisely we were chasing across these haunted rooftops and underground churches." Holmes did not look at me. Instead, he said, "The knight, Watson, a fitting emblem, was it not, moves in an L shape, unexpected, indirect, precisely the maneuver Fekete used to evade suspicion." I waited, notebook in hand. Holmes shifted slightly, his gaze still locked to the fire. "Very well," he murmured. "Let us speak then, not of criminals, but of men, of motives, memory, and the dreadful things done when the board is overturned." And so the explanation began. "Colonel Fekete," Holmes began, "was not always a traitor. During the latter years of the war, he served honourably. He was, in fact, instrumental in liaising with British intelligence in the Balkans. Until—" Holmes raised one hand slightly. "The incident at Drenopol." "The failed uprising?" I asked. "Precisely. An ill-timed rebellion, encouraged by British whispers and promises. It ended in ruin. Fekete's wife and 2 children, still residing in the village, were killed in the reprisals. The colonel was left with a commendation from London and a blood-soaked farmstead." I said nothing. Holmes continued. "He changed that day, Watson, from a man of orders to a man of schemes. He began playing a different game, a game of chess not across territory, but across time. And he played it backward." "How do you mean?" "Instead of strategizing toward victory, he maneuvered toward erasure. Every individual who had been part of that ill-fated mission, agents, informants, even sympathetic officials, began dying, quietly, elegantly, like pawns removed from a board before the audience notices. And Rosnyai? A message boy, perhaps unwilling, perhaps not, used to deliver sealed orders bearing the knight's emblem. Each message pointed toward the next move. A chain of assassination, Watson. Fekete played as if he were tidying up after a misplayed match. In truth, he was seeking catharsis." Holmes sighed faintly. The British abandoned him, he felt. But revenge was too brutish for a man like Fekete. He needed something more refined. Thus, the knight moved. There was a long pause. "And so," Holmes said finally, "he became not the general of a war, but the curator of a silence." "What of the phrase?" I asked. "That line in the half-burnt letter. He who writes in red ink writes last. You said it wasn't poetic." "It was not," Holmes replied. "It was procedural, a signal." He rose and fetched a small folded page from the inner pocket of his dressing gown. During 1915, Allied agents operating in Serbia and northern Bulgaria adopted a crude but effective failsafe. When a mission was compromised or an operative needed to withdraw without raising suspicion, They were instructed to send a message, including the phrase, "red ink." It was a code for abort. So the letter we found was a desperate warning from one operative to another, Holmes concluded. A message sent far too late. He passed me the paper, and I saw now that the ink had a rusty hue to it, not quite the black I'd initially assumed. But if it was a signal to abort, I said, puzzled, why was the recipient killed shortly after? Holmes gave a thin smile. Because someone intercepted it. Faceti, most likely. Once he recognized the phrase, he would have known that another ghost from Drinopol was still alive. That letter sealed the sender's fate. I stared at the fire, the embers pulsing softly like the dying heartbeats of the men whose names we never learned. Red ink, I murmured. A curious symbol. To a historian, perhaps, Holmes replied. To Faceti, it was a final name to cross off the list. Then the murders, I said slowly, were not random. Nothing in Faceti's design was random, Holmes replied. Each victim corresponded to a player in the 1915 operation, their positions, their loyalties, their silences. He paused and tilted his head. But more fascinating still, Watson, was the choreography. Each killing was constructed to mirror a chess strategy. The bookstore owner, smothered, as if by suffocation. Symbolic of Zugzwang, where any move leads to defeat. The diplomat in Belgrade, found drowned, with no signs of struggle. A clean liquidation. The quiet capture. I blinked. You mean to say he staged the deaths to resemble tactics? To those with the eye to see it, yes, and who, I ask you, would possess that eye? Only one who had studied the board intimately, a man who had made it his confession. I could not help but shudder. So every victim was a square. Or a sacrifice, Holmes corrected. Faceti orchestrated a game where he alone knew the rules, and the end was predetermined. Rosnyai may have believed he was helping a cause. In truth, he was sweeping the ashes of a fire long since extinguished. Outside, the first faint stirrings of morning brushed against the shutters. I suddenly felt as though we had emerged from a different world entirely. And the game is over now? I asked. Holmes glanced up at me. For Faceti, yes. But for the rest of us, Watson, he let the sentence hang. As always, it was I who had to finish it, in the margins of my notes, and in the echo of footsteps down a fog-draped street. Holmes tapped the scorched night chess piece, now encased in a handkerchief and resting on the table between us. His eyes gleamed not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man fitting the final piece into a worn puzzle. That seal, he said, was our turning point. I frowned. Surely such a trinket could be purchased anywhere, by anyone. Not this one, Holmes replied. It is made of black beeswax, polished and compressed using a steel mould, unique to the diplomatic set issued in 1916 to British field liaisons in the Balkans. Only 12 sets were ever made. And Faceti, I asked, was never officially issued one, Holmes said. But he served as a translator at the embassy during the spring of 17. There was a breach in protocol during an evacuation. 2 sets went unaccounted for when the embassy was relocated. One was later recovered in Vienna. The other was Faceti's, I finished. Holmes gave the smallest of nods. He used it not merely to seal messages, but to signal those who knew the symbol. A knight, the elusive, sidestepping piece. It was both signature and metaphor. It would have meant nothing to most, but to those few left alive who knew its origin, Holmes said softly, it was a memory branded in wax. The seal, it seemed, had spoken not in Hungarian or Russian, but in perfect English, and in silence it had betrayed the man who wielded it. He was careful, I said, unreasonably so. I can't think of another case where the trail felt so deliberately faint. Holmes smiled. That is always the danger with clever men, Watson. They bury their footsteps so well, they forget to leave any for themselves. I waited. It was the second body, Holmes continued. The solicitor found in the library. Fekete was the first to discover it. By his own account, he had followed a noise and come upon the man in the dark. Yes, I remember, I said. And he fetched the night constable. Precisely. But tell me, how did he know it was murder? I blinked. There was no blood, no wound visible. The poison had paralyzed the man's muscles. He looked as if he had fallen asleep at his desk. And yet Fekete claimed at once that the solicitor had been killed. I sat back. So either he made a wild assumption, or he already knew what had transpired, Holmes concluded. It was the only piece that didn't fit. A man so meticulous, so precise in every move, and then a leap of logic so brazen it rang like a cracked bell. And that was when you knew. I suspected, Holmes said. I knew when he returned to the scene after the fact, ostensibly to assist the investigation, but in truth, to retrieve the seal he had left behind. A fatal vanity, I murmured. As fatal as any weapon, Holmes agreed. That night, long after the fire had burned down to a low red glow, I found myself unable to sleep. Holmes sat in the armchair, unmoving, his silhouette etched against the window pane, where the fog of early morning threatened once more to swallow the city. You were right, I said softly. It was not a case for triumph. Holmes stirred, his voice unusually distant. There are no victories, Watson, only conclusions. But justice was done. Holmes did not answer at once. When he did, his voice lacked its usual irony. Justice is a shapeshifter, especially in the wake of empires. A man like Fekete was both tool and hand, victim and executioner. And the others, the ones who perished along the way, they were names on a roster once, Holmes said, and then ghosts behind curtains. In war, flags give men clarity. In peace, those flags are folded and shadows remain. It troubled me, that truth, that we had unearthed a motive so soaked in history it could never be rinsed clean, that Holmes had pursued it not with passion, but with the remorseless logic of a surgeon removing a foreign object from a wound already infected. Did it bring you any peace? I asked. He glanced at me, expression unreadable. Peace is a sentiment, Watson. I deal in facts. Outside, a church bell chimed 6. The fog pressed closer against the glass. We left Budapest the following day, the wheels of the train groaning across frozen rails as we sped westward toward Calais and the channel beyond. Holmes did not read, nor did he smoke. He simply stared out the window at the landscape blurring past, lost in his own thoughts. Only once did he speak, as we passed through the grey emptiness between towns. The board is clear, Watson, he said. But I wonder if the game is ever truly won. I said nothing. It was not a question meant to be answered. I opened my journal and looked at the notes I had scribbled, the seal, the phrase in red ink, the poisoned solicitor, the guilt of a man too intelligent for his own salvation, and Fekete, finally stripped of his illusions. There was no cheering crowd at the checkmate, no thunder of finality, only silence and a long, unbroken horizon. Even the master of logic, I wrote later, cannot always predict the heart's next move. The pale mist hung low over Kellerty station as Holmes and I took our places aboard the westbound train. The platform was still damp from an early drizzle, and the faint rumble of awakening city life reached us amid the quiet bustle of porters and passengers. Holmes stood at the window, his gaze distant, almost as if the mist outside mirrored the haze still clouding his thoughts. I watched the crowd, faces anxious, weary, or simply indifferent, each bearing their own stories of hope and regret. The train whistle shattered the momentary calm, and with a gentle shove, we began to move away from Budapest, from its shadows and secrets. Yet even as the city disappeared into the morning fog, the case lingered, etched in our memories like the faintest footprints on freshly fallen snow. destined to be pursued long after the wheels ceased their turning. I ventured softly, "Holmes, do you ever regret Verwood's death? Could it have been prevented?" For a moment, he remained silent, the faintest crease crossing his brow. Then, in a tone uncharacteristically distant, he said, "Regret is the luxury of those who believe the game is fair, Watson." He paused, eyes reflecting the pale light. "We operate in a world where every move costs something, and sometimes the price is a life." I knew then that beneath Holmes's detached exterior lay a deep current of sorrow, one he concealed behind intellect and wit. "The truth," he continued, "is that clarity is rarely a comfort. It is a burden. We see the board as it is, not as we wish it. And sometimes the pieces we lose are those we cannot replace." Holmes turned from the window and regarded me with that sharp, calculating look. "Espionage, Watson, is less a struggle between good and evil than a game of shadows. Players move unseen pieces, knights, pawns, ghosts, across a board whose borders shift with the tides of history." He tapped his fingers lightly on the windowsill. "Each pawn sacrificed is a secret buried. Each knight's leap, a calculated deception. The tragedy is that the spectators rarely understand the rules, only the casualties." I considered his words, the weight of unseen forces manipulating lives for causes obscured by time. "And yet, Holmes, is justice served in such a game?" He smiled faintly, a ghost of amusement. "Justice, dear Watson, is but a reflection of power. Sometimes it is meted out by kings, sometimes by shadows lurking beneath their thrones." The train rumbled steadily westward when Holmes unfolded a telegram. Its crisp edges betrayed urgency. His eyes flickered as he read. A Fabergé egg stolen from a Viennese palace was the talk of diplomatic circles. "Another game," he murmured. "Another board." For a moment, the faintest smile curved his lips. "It seems, Watson, that the Danube's shadows stretch far beyond Budapest. Our work is never truly done." I folded my notebook, the case closed for now, but the dance of knights and pawns ongoing beneath a new moon. As I closed the leather-bound casebook, I found myself reflecting on the nature of the game we had played, a game with no true winners. Holmes had outwitted the adversaries, yet even he could not foresee every move. "Even the master of logic," I wrote, "cannot always anticipate the unpredictable nature of the human heart. Therein lay the mystery that reason alone could not solve, the passions, fears, and frailties that propel men to acts of desperation or courage remained beyond the reach of deduction." Holmes, ever the eternal strategist, faced a world where every calculated step risked an unforeseen counter-strike. And so, beneath the quiet surface of victory, lay the truth that life is a game perpetually unfolding, its final checkmate always just beyond our grasp. As we settled back in our compartment, the mist still clinging to the rails behind us, Holmes regarded me with that familiar gleam of detached satisfaction. "This case," he mused, "reminds us that even the most intricate games of strategy are ultimately human affairs, where pride, fear, and loss dictate the final move more than cold logic ever could." He paused, fingers lightly tapping the armrest. "Tell me, Watson, and you, dear listener, what do you think was the criminal's gravest error? Was it a misstep in the game, or a failure to foresee the unyielding mind that pursued him? If this puzzle has intrigued you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of deduction and deception, and share this mystery with fellow enthusiasts. The game is always afoot. Until next time.